Thank you to everyone for your interesting presentations. I think that we covered quite a breadth of the scientific and also kind of a regulatory and policy side of vaccines. I thought I would start with a broad question, and I'll let you decide who would like to answer it. But given that a lot of the conversation this morning was about other existing interventions and interventions that are in the pipeline, I just wonder if anyone can comment on what you see the value of vaccines will be in, I think it was said before, controlling, eradicating, and or eliminating NTDs, and what the important value adds are. Does anyone want to take this?
I can make a comment, I guess, that has already been mentioned several times this morning, that certainly, with in most cases with the vaccines, I think that are coming forward, certainly for any NTD, it would be in the context of chemotherapy. That it's not about trying to replace chemotherapy or to say that chemotherapy is outdated and bad in any way. I mean, I don't think for the NTDs, with perhaps a possible exception of leprosy in some places, that the resistance problem is such a big issue yet that we can just say, well, it's we're beyond the drug being useful. So I think it's a case of using all the tools we have available, but using the drugs for as long as possible, but being prepared sufficiently early that our vaccine pipelines are ready to use alongside drugs for as long as possible, and maybe extending the life of these drugs as well. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can follow on to that with something you raised, but also that was raised in the keynote speech. Sir Roy Anderson also mentioned this issue of, what did you call it? The abyss, or the Valley of Death. The Valley of Death. Yeah. And so I guess my next question is, and I don't know if this is something you wanted to answer or if you were hoping other panelists had comments on, but how can we address that Valley of Death? And I think that there were some comments from Ms. Kallenberg on potential ways to incentivize or bring forward the right R&D, but I think that the funding issues are a big one, especially because commercial incentives can be quite low for industry to get involved in late stage development. Yeah. I would prefer someone else to open that one. I mean, all I can say about Valley of Death is, I mean, it's been known about for decades, and everyone, I think, in industry and academia knows the problem. Even for something where there is potentially a big market, there's still an awful lot of wastage and an awful lot of issues around actually predicting what the key molecule, whatever it is, or vaccine candidate is going to be at an early enough stage that you don't waste millions, if not billions, on something that eventually fails. Yeah. And I think it's so difficult, even in a case where there is a market, that in our case, you've got the added level of, often a lack of market, which really, it's amazing we've achieved anything in NTDs, to be honest, I think, with those sort of limitations that are in our way. But I think we've reached that stage with onchocerciasis where, we think we've got very good candidates, and we think we've got as good evidence as anyone else has had, really, for a vaccine candidate to go into phase 1. And yet, finding the funding for that next step. I think phase 1 in particular, there's still a big gap around, because we've got EDCTP for later trials. I think they've just started funding in some exceptional cases at phase 1, but that wasn't the case in the first iteration of EDCTP. Yeah, thank you. Maybe we can hear a little bit from the industry perspective. I'm curious, I know that the case of Ebola is a unique one because of some of the risks and the threats that you mentioned in your presentation. But I wonder if you can comment a bit on how a company can make decisions to engage in this kind of risky research. And I think you mentioned partnerships a few times, so I can imagine that might be part of your answer. But also how to continue and sustain that investment. And I think that question applies very well to NTDs.
Yes, I think there are many different factors that can trigger a company investing in the field, and in general, it's a combination of technical readiness and capacity to develop a vaccine, and business perspectives, and then a portfolio in the company. With a case like Ebola, we were having the technical readiness. We were not having any business case, and there is not yet any business case. But it was also possible in terms of portfolio, because Johnson & Johnson is a large company with many other drugs, medical device, and many different products. You can have some projects that you move forward simply for public health good, but you cannot have all your projects like that. So I think this question, yes, of portfolio is also important, and probably Ebola was somehow a unique case, or maybe among few cases we have like that. But it won't be sustainable for a company to only rely on this type of products.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, it would be good to open the floor for questions, and then we can come back to me if there isn't enough coming from the floor.
I have two questions actually to Madame Mathieu concerning the Ebola vaccine. And one is, can you look a little bit on what is the projected use in future of this vaccine? Is this going to be, do you forecast a widespread use? Because you said at the very end of the talk, we should end the Ebola case, and we know Ebola is usually occurring in places where God lost his shoes, so in very, very remote areas. And or do you actually go for revaccinations or whatever? And the second question just follows up on that. Is there any intention to actually, quotation, make use of the new outbreak in the Oriol in DRC for actually further testing the Ebola vaccines? Because I've worked in that area, and this is really a place you only can fly in with very, very small planes, like 2 hours from the next airport. Is there any activity that is planned?
So for the first part of your question, what I would say is that the use which is foreseen for Ebola vaccines in the very, very short term can be both reactive use in case of outbreak or prophylactic use. So far, there is a strategic advisory group of experts on immunization at WHO who have made a recommendation for reactive use of one vaccine which is more advanced than our vaccine today. Because based on the evidence which is available today, it's the only thing which was possible. In the future, I don't know if there is, if there will be a prophylactic use or not. We can foresee prophylactic use, for example, in healthcare workers who are susceptible to be exposed to this type of disease more frequently, or prophylactic use in some countries where epidemics are recurring. So for us, it's more uncertainty than certainty. And there has been also some mathematical modeling made showing that as most outbreaks have been small, a relatively limited vaccination campaign around the case could work. So it's where we are today. So regarding the current outbreak in DRC, as a company, our vaccine is still an investigational vaccine. We don't have yet a marketing authorization. Nevertheless, we have phase 1 data, we have quality of the vaccine which is documented, and inventory. So today we stand ready, and we are as prepared as possible to be able to respond to a request. But it's international stakeholders, it's WHO, it's the national government who can take the initiative. So it's how we see our role.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up on the mathematical modeling, there is a maximum important factor that should go into that, and that's how the health system is set up and what traditional beliefs are, because that was one of the major causes of the major outbreak in West Africa versus DRC. And that's why the DRC outbreaks usually are relatively maintained. And that is, if somebody is actually intervening in DRC, these people are usually welcome and are integrated. And in West Africa, where traditional healers have a political and medical influence, a very, very strong one, this was actually hindered. So you're talking about absolutely different situations.
Thank you. I think there was a question down here.
Gary Finning is my name. I'm a health journalist and I write for Break Dengue for Vaccines Today. Question for GAVI, when you mentioned dengue vaccines, is it the Sanofi one only or also others like Takeda and maybe Merck that might be considered? And while I have the microphone, Valerie, you mentioned a biometric verification system to check that you were giving the second dose to the right person. Is that used in other vaccines, or is it a commonly used approach to checking that you've got the right person?
Thank you for the question. At last time around, when we did the review in 2013, we only considered the Sanofi candidate because of this cutoff point that we use, that we only consider vaccines whose licensure is anticipated within 5 years, and the Takeda candidate at the time wasn't within that boundary. I think now we will be in a different situation. So in this upcoming round, we'll consider both candidates most likely.
And are they considered separately, or is it kind of as a class? Like if the Sanofi one makes it, would the Takeda one automatically come in, or is it reassessed from scratch?
They would both be considered as potential investments in a dengue vaccine. We don't when GAVI adds a vaccine to the portfolio, we don't specify the product or the manufacturer. And if down the line a new product becomes available, that is better. We wouldn't have to go through the whole process again. So the VIS is really looking at the vaccine preventable disease. And the available products against that disease.
So in Sierra Leone, we developed a biometric identification system which was initially based on fingerprint and iris scan. We had to develop this because people were not having ID cards with any picture, and often they were having a first name and family name which were the same. So it was not possible to accurately identify people. Actually, in the same country, a fingerprint was used previously for votations. So the need to identify people is not something which is only the case in healthcare and not only the case for vaccines. It was very important for a vaccine clinical trial with visits where people had to come on a regular basis with 2 doses that you have to give with a very precise interval. And progressively we moved to identification only based on iris scan because it revealed performing very well, and it does not need any contact. So in the context of an infectious disease, it was seen as an advantage, and it was well perceived by the population, well received. We really would like this being made available to many other needs, and to give any kind of treatment that you have to repeat on a regular basis, or to give any other vaccination program with several injections. It could be very useful.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on the floor?
I have a question for Eyoh. It's a very clever study designed to identify the difference between the immune responses to the schistosome infection. I was just wondering whether you have any updates since the last publication. I noticed it's 2015.
Yeah. So currently we have a patent that's going through for a vaccine that we have actually started to develop, which I'm not at liberty to talk too much about, but we do have updates from that original study that shows that there's a way to actually grab different epitopes based on the model there's a way that you can actually grab different epitopes and construct a vaccine with encompassing all these different epitopes.
I just wondered if I could respond to your first question. Again, not knowing that much about the scientific development of vaccines against some of these diseases. I mean, it seems to me that we have to be honest that it's actually quite a formidable challenge. This, incentivizing industry and the funding question, because we're talking about vaccines that don't really have a market in the high-income world. Even in the developing world, it's probably not a huge market. Most of them, we're not talking about epidemic diseases, so there isn't the sort of global health security argument that is, that sort of brings an additional lens of interest to some donors. I think it is a formidable challenge. I don't know if everyone would agree. I was thinking about what precedents do we have, and I wonder if there's lessons to be learned from the Manafravac example, which was quite a unique public-private partnership, product development partnership with a tech transfer and funding from the Gates Foundation and others with PATH and an Indian company that then developed a very low-cost vaccine against meningitis A that was rolled out in the meningitis belt and had a tremendous impact. And I also wondered about the AMR lens, because that's now being talked about so much as an issue of great concern in global health. And there's we're hearing it a lot in the donor fora where we operate in. There's real interest in this, and it sounds like from what I've seen on some of the posters and in the presentations that this is a potential lens that could actually benefit efforts to seek funding for some of these projects. So I don't know if anyone has thoughts about that, but these were just some thoughts that occurred to me when you asked that question.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of your points, and I actually have a question for you in response. I think your examples of the precedent make sense with Manafravac. I wonder also about RTSS. I mean, malaria is a very different disease, and so the parallels won't be the same. But also, I think that the pilots that are going underway are an opportunity to learn. And I guess my question for you is, what do you see? Given that we haven't seen a vaccine for NTD, so it would be hard to say. But what do you see the largest implementation barriers might be to access? Because I think that the innovation barriers are quite clear, and from the presentations today, there's been a lot of focus on the scientific complexities. But of course, if we are able to get over these funding gaps and push things towards approval, there are going to be implementation issues as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And RTSS is a really interesting case study. I keep saying someone needs to write this up. When you look at the history, it's fascinating in terms of how not just how the vaccine developed, but how the public opinion changed and evolved over time about this vaccine that, of course, everyone was very, very enthusiastic about initially, and then, that faded a bit as the trial results came out. And then there was this sort of turn where suddenly there was concerns about safety signals and, we can't actually roll this out, the efficacy is too low. We need to pilot it first, and that in turn raised a lot of suspicion from, on the side of the countries and other funders. And at one point, GAVI was in the middle of that because we were asked to fund pilots, which we ultimately, our board decided to do. Why aren't we jumping up and down for a malaria vaccine? That seems crazy, right? And I think, the implementation aspect is important because this is a vaccine that requires 4 doses, including several doses given outside of the current EPI schedule, and one of them given in the 2nd year of life. And there's simply no platform right now to reach kids. So even if in the trials you've been able to give 4 doses, and to be honest, 39% efficacy for a vaccine against a disease that is so prevalent isn't that bad in my view. But of course, you've got to be able to get those 4 doses in, and that's a big reason for the pilots now, because we really don't know if that is feasible, and that's a perspective that I think many researchers and manufacturers need to have from the very start. How does this fit into the realities of developing country systems? What are the synergies, and what will be the challenges? I mean, if it's a great vaccine but it needs to be kept at -20, or it's got 6 booster doses, the effectiveness probably goes down a lot. I think that's a very important perspective that needs to be built in from the very start, and that probably requires partnerships to involve a forward-looking view and different partners from the very beginning.
Coming from the basic science point of view, I think we do struggle because it depends what you want to do. Do you want to control or do you want to eliminate? And studying schistosomiasis, the drug therapy, I spent my whole presentation talking about how you use a drug therapy to discover this antigen. The drug therapy is very effective, but it's not going to be enough for elimination. So if we truly want elimination, vaccine, in most cases, is the way to go. But I know for a fact that when I do talk about vaccine for schistosomiasis, undoubtedly someone would ask me, do we really need a vaccine? And I think what they're asking is, are we really looking for elimination or control? And I think we have to decide what we want. And also, in my case, I cannot speak for anybody else, what is lacking in the way we think about this vaccine is innovation. Because sometimes we get stuck doing things that we used to do it, and we really do not allow ourselves to think outside the box. And that's basically because there's no incentives coming in. There's no maybe a bigger market or bigger financial incentive that says, okay, try something new. Because if you try something new, undoubtedly you need money to try something new and something clever. It's not cheap. And the method that I've introduced is something that we have come up with, but it's something that it's not going to be a cheap process. So you have to wear that in. When you're a basic scientist trying to discover some of these things, sometimes you're hampered by what you can actually feasibly do. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. I think it comes back nicely to the first question I asked around the value of vaccines for NTDs. And I think also just to build a little bit on the points about thinking about the characteristics of a vaccine early on. I think it's true, and in my perspective, target product profiles being developed to identify what we'd like to see in these vaccines is very important, but also at the first attempt or the first success, it's not always possible to achieve the basic successes that you need at the same time as other ideal characteristics. And I think maybe that's why we see RTSS with some characteristics that are really promising and others that are quite difficult on the implementation side.
And sometimes a vaccine with lower efficacy but easier implementation feasibility is actually better than higher efficacy.
Absolutely.
So it's trade-offs.
Before we wrap up, is there any burning question? I don't see one. Okay, so thank you again to everyone for contributing. I think the conversation was very interesting, and hopefully we can continue over coffee as necessary. Thank you.